We begin the day with the coronavirus pandemic in China, the pandemic that just isn't getting better. Most of the world has learned how to live with the virus, so much so that we now talk about a return to normal. But it is the opposite in China. New daily COVID cases have hit record highs 6 days running. Cities are back under lockdown, and this in a country with a zero COVID policy. A pressure cooker of COVID restrictions that has begun exploding. Over the weekend across the country, protests erupted against orders to remain at home yet again. Most striking, there are public calls for President Xi Xinping to resign. Now, China's vast police force may be able to restore order, but what or how long can the world's second largest economy, the factory to the world, how long can it afford to keep going this way? Zero COVID is weighing heavily. So far, Xi Jinping's leadership does not offer a prescription for relief.
In downtown Shanghai, a heavy police presence has replaced the huge protests which filled these streets. Police cars, trucks and officers are out in force. Huge fences now in place to stop crowds gathering. Authorities here are working to remove all evidence of the protests, demanding these women delete photos from their phones. Here they arrest one protester, with police telling reporters the man didn't obey their arrangements. He's not the only one to have been detained. This social media footage shows a BBC journalist being arrested while protesters chant for his release. The BBC says he was assaulted before being freed. Chinese authorities say he didn't properly identify himself. The protests are an extremely rare show of dissent, with many here reaching their limits.
I think everyone has their own demands in this matter. I think it's good for the environment of the whole country to have such a space for discussion.
Rallies in solidarity with China's demonstrations have now spread around the world. Large crowds gathered outside the embassy in London. And here in Tokyo, calling for an end to China's strict COVID restrictions. But Chinese authorities are refusing to change course.
We believe that with leadership and the support of the Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
There has been a slight easing of restrictions in the western city of Urumqi, where a deadly apartment fire last week sparked much of the recent unrest. Some residents who've been confined to their homes for months can travel on local buses from Tuesday. Some small relief, but far from the end to the government's zero COVID policy that so many are demanding.
Journalist Fabian Kretschmer is in Beijing. He has more on what is happening on the ground.
Yeah, today, it seems calm here, also in Beijing, where several hundreds, if not thousands, of protesters gathered last night, but still you see a lot of police, not only in uniforms, also in plainclothes, and it could snap any time, and it's really a tense atmosphere. And me as a journalist, I was immediately kicked out of the protest site just by standing there when they identified me as a journalist. So let's see how it will develop. But I mean, in Shanghai, what the authorities did, they basically fenced off all the squares, they fenced off several streets. But I mean, yeah, that's of course intimidating, and we know that there have been several arrests, but I mean, what they cannot do is to change the attitude. There were already so many protesters out there last night, and they achieved it, they did it, and many people saw it, and they spread from word to word, and I think that has a big impact.
I'm joined now by Mary Gallagher. She's a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. She is also the director of the Center for Chinese Studies. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. We just heard our reporter there talking about the Monday calm and the fact that there's still this tension in the air. How do you read that? I mean, are we past the protests?
Well, I think we've seen in the last 24 hours just a hugely increased police presence, these arrests and the barricades that have gone up, the harassment of journalists. So it's possible that, the Chinese government has a lot of capacity. They can shut these protests down, but they're not really going to solve the problem, right? There's still going to be a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of anger underneath about the lockdowns and about zero COVID, and also just about the political environment. I think a lot of people believe that the political environment is partly why the policy won't change.
Yeah, well, explain that to me, because I think people around the world are looking at this and asking themselves, are these protests solely about the pandemic and COVID, or is there something else at play here?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So these protests really did start out around COVID. They started about the fire in Urumqi, and people really saw the fire as something that could happen to themselves, right? That these lockdowns are putting their lives at risk if they need to get to the doctor if there's a fire. But what happened very quickly, which is unusual for protests in China, is that they became political, and they targeted the central government. They targeted Xi Jinping himself. And I think what's happening is that for the young, educated youth who are protesting in particular, they see the policy environment, the rigidity of zero COVID, as linked to the political environment, a political environment that's much more closed and that's very centralized around this, single leader who's now started his third term and who has made zero COVID his signature policy.
And is his signature policy going to be his first major failure?
I would say it's already clearly a failure. I think these protests are long in coming. People have been frustrated for a while. The Shanghai lockdown at the beginning of the year was really devastating. And I think that this is just people are fed up and Xi Jinping has become the target, which is, like I said, very unusual for protests in China. Usually protests are local. They target local issues and local officials. And people generally think that the central government is better. The central government is more adept. It has more capacity. But zero COVID is directly attached to the central government. It's directly attached to Xi Jinping. And it's not sustainable. And I think people have realized that as the world has moved on, China is being left behind.
And can Xi Jinping, can he do a course reversal here without losing face, getting rid of the restrictions, and by justifying it with the fact that we are the factory to the world, we have to get back to work, the supply chains on this planet depend on us?
I think they could. I think they need to switch the narrative, and they should have been doing this for several months now. It's a little bit perplexing to me, and I think to a lot of experts on China, why we haven't seen the central government be more adept at turning away from this policy gradually, boosting vaccinations among the elderly, increasing healthcare capacity, particularly ICUs, because every country that's gone through COVID has had to go through a reopening where deaths have gone up, and they have not been able to figure out a way to get the country ready for what's coming. He should be able to do that. Why they haven't been able to do that thus far is really perplexing.
Yeah, and we talk about new daily cases now hitting record high 6 days in a row. But how reliable are these statistics? Have we ever been able to really rely or believe in the numbers coming out of Beijing about this pandemic?
I think the numbers on cases is probably fairly accurate because they do so much testing. I think the deaths are probably undercounted because the way in which they designate a death from COVID is a little bit different than most other places. So I do think that the trends are probably fairly accurate. And clearly, China has done better in terms of the number of deaths, but it's partly done better because it just hasn't been able to move out of what they did at the very beginning, which were just these really massive and very, very severe lockdowns.
Professor Mary Gallagher from the University of Michigan. Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring in Lizzie Lee. She is a journalist. She works for Wall Street TV and for the China Project. That's a news platform that's based in New York. It's good to have you with us. Today we are seeing fewer images of protests compared to what we saw over the weekend. Is that because the protests are dying down, or is it because this wall of secrecy is letting nothing through without Beijing's blessing?
We saw Chinese authorities have already tightened controls in reaction to those protests which happened over the weekend, in some cases dispatching police forces to major subway stations and public squares in major Chinese cities. So I think that was definitely one of the main reasons.
What about China's zero COVID policy? It's not working. The rest of the world is moving on beyond the pandemic, economically and politically. When does this become a situation that Beijing can no longer afford to live with?
I think so far the signals are still very mixed. In some parts of the country, there were signs that local officials had already eased some of the most draconian restrictions in response to the public discontent we saw over the weekend. But just this morning, state media People's Daily issued an article reiterating support for Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy, calling it the success which has withstood the test of time and practice. So I think we'll just have to wait and see. But if there's anything we know about Xi Jinping, his instincts are all about being uncompromising in the face of any perceived challenge to the party's rule.
Well, the fact that these protests erupted so quickly and across the entire country, I mean, what does that tell us about Xi Jinping's grip on power? I mean, his grip on politics and his grip on society, they're not necessarily one and the same, are they?
Right. So at this point, I think it's still too early to tell if these protests actually threaten Xi Jinping's grip on power, but they are definitely a huge embarrassment for Xi Jinping. Despite the party's line that zero COVID policy has been a huge success, in reality, we saw, this mismanagement of local lockdowns plaguing the country, and those heavy-handedness in the handling of the country's economy by local level officials all over the place. If it continues, we can't rule out anything more dramatic happening to the country and to the leader himself.
Journalist Lizzie Lee joining us from New York tonight. Lizzie, thank you.
Thank you so much.